Hey, well, welcome to Norton Campus online. We're glad that you're with us. If you're kind of part of our community here in the location, glad that you're able to keep in touch with us this way. If you are kind of connected to Norton through online, we would love to hear from you. You can shoot us an email or message us on whatever platform you may be watching this on. But we're just glad that you are with us. I pray that these are helpful to you as you seek to follow and know Jesus. We've been going through the Sermon on the Mount for the last couple months, and we're kind of getting into the third chapter of the sermon. So much that Jesus has here. The Sermon on the Mount is Jesus's kind of magnum opus. It's kind of his biggest hit. It's kind of his main talk that he puts together that we see the theme of all throughout the New Testament, that many of the New Testament writers are pulling on themes that Jesus lays out in the Sermon on the Mount. And as we begin chapter 7 today, Jesus begins it by famously saying, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged." Now, this week was a busy week. I was kind of working on this message, and in my brain, I'm like, I gotta figure out how to get this plane off the ground, right? So when all else fails, I end up just talking about my scooter. If I've talked about my scooter before, it's a motorcycle. It's a 125. But this week, I was driving down the hill, and when you have a scooter, you don't really think about gas mileage because you get really good gas mileage, like 40, 50 miles to the gallon. But sometimes you forget about gas completely, and I have forgotten about it completely. And so I was coming down the hill, and I ran out of gas. First time in my life. I'm 33. I've never ran out of gas before. Ran out of gas. And so I'm coming down. It's kind of a busy time of day, and I'm not far from the gas station, but I'm far enough. And so I pull off to the side. I'm sitting with my scooter, try to start it up, won't start. So what I end up doing with my gas-powered 125 scooter is I kind of do one of these, and I have to actually use it like a child's scooter to get to the gas station. And while I'm doing this, there's cars going by. The helmet that I wear, I'm pretty sure is a kid's helmet. I'm pretty sure it's not made for a man's head. And I'm doing this, and the thought I have the whole time as I'm getting my scooter to the gas station is, don't judge me. Looking at all these judgy trucks and Priuses driving by, like, don't judge me, right? I'm just a clergyman from up the street trying to get to work, right? Judgment is something that we all do. It's something that we all hate. It's something that we all experience, and it's something that we all dole out. And as I was preparing for this week, I asked myself, why is it that we judge people? Just sometimes you got to ask yourself the simple question, like, why do I, as a human, why am I judgmental about things? I think there could be a number of reasons. I know many times we judge because, this is what our parents taught us, we were young oftentimes, we judge because we are insecure ourselves. Right? That there's something that we feel insecure about, so we judge others to make ourselves feel better, right? That's what our parents said about every bully in school, right? I think sometimes it's just pride. We think we can do something better. We have a better handle on something. If it was our way, it would have been done better. So we judge other people on how they do things, the decisions they make. For some of us, we're just disenfranchised with the way things turned out. Maybe we're bitter, maybe we're cynical, and so we judge as a way of making ourselves feel better about the situation that we're in, right? For some of us, it might be fear. We judge because we don't want things to turn out a certain way, and so judgment is kind of this way of pushing things off from really getting to us. I think sometimes we're just embarrassed, right? We flopped on something, or we just something didn't play out the way we thought it would. We're just kind of embarrassed about it, and so we judge because, like, if I'm embarrassed, I want you to be embarrassed too, right? There's a lot of ways, in which leads to this all kinds of unique interactions when you start to put the people in our lives together, right? When I've got judgment and this person has judgment, like, it can create some unique situations. In my undergrad, one of the most helpful things, if you ever come in to meet with me, I'll probably write this on the board at some point. It's one of the few things I've maybe gained from my undergrad. Was by a guy named Jon Stewart, not the one who did The Daily Show, a different Jon Stewart who was a professional in communication. He said this: communication, kind of our verbal and nonverbal interaction in relationship to each other, is continuous, complex, and collaborative. It's continuous. We're always communicating. If we're having a good day, if we're in a bad mood, if we're excited, we're always communicating. Things we say, if we don't say anything and we think we're not communicating, that's communicating something. We're always communicating. But communication is also complex, right? It's not simple as me just saying something to you receiving it and saying something back. It depends on the kind of day I had, the kind of mood I'm in, my insecurities, your expectations, your story, your background, your pain, and you bring these things together, it can be complex. If you're a human with any relationship, you know this to be true. And it's also collaborative. All communication is the two parties coming together. And that communication happens within that relationship. And so all of these things come together and it can get messy. We all have stories and expectations and hurts and preferences and blind spots and ways that we think things should be done and how the world should work. And we bring this together as different people and it can get messy. There can be some tension that we need to navigate. And all through the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus addresses these relational tensions like forgiveness, like turning the other cheek, like our objectification of others, the promises that we make, how we relate to people that may be our enemies, and how in the midst of all this, we are to be people of the kingdom who walk in light of that as we walk into these tensions. And so today, Jesus leads us through another, the tension of judgment and discernment. And he says this, we'll read the passage, and we're just going to kind of walk through it today. Starting in verse 1, he says, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use it, it will be measured to you." That is, I think that's sobering, right? "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take that speck out of your eye,' when all the time there's a plank in your own eye, you hypocrite? First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." Then he kind of takes a left turn, it feels like. "Don't give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet, and then turn and tear you to pieces." Now, you may have heard some of this before. You know, the log in the eye sounds very familiar. I think parts of this passage sound kind of perplexing. They sound a little harsh, if we're being honest, right? But I believe what Jesus gives us here is kind of this progression as we interact with others. As we're coming into these complex interactions, these kind of maybe confusing tensions, Jesus almost gives us this framework to kind of turn the mirror in on ourselves as we walk into these interactions and help us navigate this tension. He begins by us looking inward. Kind of takes us from this position of pride to humility. Look what he says. "Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you." Starts right off with almost this humility of going from a position of pride. If you're going to judge, be careful, because that same measure is going to be used to you, and it kind of naturally causes us to be humble in light of that truth. But this is important for the sake of today. As we begin, I almost want to take a little side road right away and look at what he is not saying. Jesus is not saying disregard moral clarity or discernment in certain situations. That's not what he's saying. He's not like, well, you can't judge, so just ignore all that and just turn a blind eye. Many of the instructions Jesus gives us requires us to assess, to evaluate, and to apply wisdom. He's going to do so multiple times throughout this chapter. Invite us to discern, right? To judge out a situation, right? Now, oftentimes, my wife's name is Sarah, and we're coming up on 10 years this month. And oftentimes, you figure out the marriage. I'm the naive one in the relationship, and she's the one who's a little bit more skeptical. Like if we're by a bank and there's a guy coming out in like a black and white striped shirt with a mask on, I'm like, oh, they must have changed the dress code at the bank, right? And she's like, that's a burglar, right? Like we can often have this dynamic. And so one time we had moved into our house initially, and sometimes you move into a house, you're figuring out what everything is. And one night, there's a knock at the door. And so I open the door, and there's this gentleman. He doesn't look scary, right? Then I know scary, right? Because I'm little and everything looks scary. But this guy is at the door, and I'm like, "Hello, sir." And he's like, "Hi." He has no uniform on. He's just in a polo and khakis, And I said, "Hello, sir." And he says, "Hi, I would like to take a look at your furnace." I'm like, "Okay," right? And then my wife is like behind the door, and she hits me. I'm like, "Yes." She's like, "Who is this guy?" I'm like, "I don't know. He wants to look at our furnace." She's like, "No." And so I tell him, actually, it's not going to work tonight. And he just simply says, "Okay," and he leaves. I was just going to let some dude come hang out in the house, right? I'm naive. She's a little skeptical. Serves us well, right? Because she's assessing the situation, judging the situation, right? It's a healthy thing to do. But oftentimes what happens is we take what Jesus says, this don't judge, And we take that, and it's become kind of this modern maxim, right? This little phrase we say, don't judge me, you can't judge me. And we may not say it that way, but it kind of becomes this maxim that we believe, that we pull from what Jesus says, and we make it mean something else, that we can do what we want with no accountability or no input, right? If I make an immoral decision, don't judge me. If I make an unwise decision, you can't judge me, right? That maybe we're in embarrassing circumstances where we kind of got egg on our face and we're like, you can't judge me, right? It kind of becomes this modern maxim. And for some of us listening, it can be easy to say, oh, I know people that do that. I know some in this generation or some of these individuals who don't care what the Bible says and they say, don't judge me. I know some people like that. But I think we need to be careful because we need to look at our own heart. It's easy to think of people that act that way, but how do I respond when someone calls me on something? When someone is concerned about sin in my own life? Do I have voices in my own life that can call me on things? It's worth asking us these questions, right? Because in our walk with Jesus, there are proactive aspects of our discipleship, right? I could pray, I can read the scriptures, I can have these disciplines in my life, I can come to worship, and these things are proactive ways that Jesus changes me. But there's also reactive aspects of my discipleship. And sometimes that's a lot more telling about what's actually going on inside. What happens when I'm challenged? What happens when I'm scared? What happens when I'm annoyed or when I'm offended? Because we can all have this subtle, don't judge me. Don't evaluate you can't do that. And we can all kind of quickly go down that road. Jesus is not saying we can't ever assess a situation, right? So if Jesus isn't saying that we can never evaluate or press on something or judge something, what is he saying? Because he says, do not judge, right? What is he saying? I think the best way is from an old pastor named John Stott. When he says, do not judge, it boils down to this. He's not prohibiting judgment, but judgmentalism. He's not prohibiting judgment. We have to all evaluate, make assessments, kind of press into things, right? To be discerning. That's not what he's saying. Not prohibiting judgment, but judgmentalism. This attitude that we are superior. This attitude that we can think that we're better than others. That it's our job to make sure we know how everybody's doing and let them know how they're doing, right? I mean, think about it this way. Judgment is considering how to maybe wisely respond to a friend who's walking through a marital problem. You have a friend, they're walking through a marital relational issue, and judgment is how do I best help out this situation and steer them to Jesus? Judgmentalism says, I can't believe that they're having this problem. I wouldn't have this problem. They're dumb, right? That judgment is deciding, man, I have a friend who's struggling with addiction. What is the best way I can help them? I don't want to enable, I want to lead and encourage. What's the best way to do that? Judgmentalism is looking down our nose and not seeing our own addictions, saying, I can't believe this person's wrestling with this, and being blind to our own addictions. Judgment is assessing, but how do I faithfully follow Jesus in maybe this complex situation or circumstance? How do I navigate this at work? How do I navigate my response to my family? Like, it feels like a gray area. How do I properly judge and with wisdom navigate this situation? Judgmentalism is looking at every situation and saying, I know how they should do it. I know the right answer to this because I just know everything. You start to kind of see the difference, the judgment versus judgmentalism. Judgmentalism is this attitude where we primarily look at the problem. Judgment is maybe looking at the person and saying, how can I help correct them? I'm looking at the person, right? And my fear is that oftentimes, many times within the church, we can kind of mask judgmentalism with concern. Like really, we can oftentimes, and I know this is true about me, we can have this spirit of judgmentalism, but we mask it in concern. And how do we know if that's where we're falling? How do we know if that's the situation? I think sometimes we have to look at the proportions, right? What are the proportions from panic to prayer, right? If I'm operating judgmentalism, I'm panicking about situations, about the way things are turning out versus being prayerful and wise. That if I'm primarily giving my opinion on things, I'm probably leaning toward judgmentalism. But if I'm actually acting in a situation, if I look and say, where am I actually showing up to help, care for, pray for this person, this situation? Maybe I'm showing action, right? If I have a lot more hand-wringing going on, right? A lot more, I'm not sure, I got to give my opinion, my thoughts, my 2 cents, versus hand-raising, right? It might show me if I actually believe that God is sovereign in this situation. I look at the proportion of these things, might point to the fact if I'm operating in judgmentalism or judgment. One pastor named Matt Smethurst says, self-righteousness is the art of always being most bothered by someone else's sin. Self-righteousness, judgmentalism, is the art of always being most bothered by someone else's sin. I think that's exposing today, right? And it's interesting what Jesus says, for in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it'll be measured to you. Simply just means this. I think Stott sums this up so well. If we pose as judges, we cannot plead ignorance to the law we claim to be able to administer. If we enjoy occupying the bench, we must not be surprised to find ourselves on trial. It's kind of a taste of our own medicine situation, right? If I claim to have the right answer and everything, then I can't be surprised when I find myself in that same seat. But Peter, in his letter, says this, all of you, clothe yourselves in humility towards one another. I love that picture. Clothe ourselves in humility towards one another. And then he quotes the Proverbs and he says, God opposes the proud, but shows favor, gives grace to the humble. Because if you're proud, if you're in the seat of judgmentalism, you don't see your need for grace because you're right. But God opposes that because it doesn't need him. This is natural, right? But he shows grace. He offers grace, offers favor to those who are humble, who say, I need this. I need your wisdom. I need your grace. Clothing ourselves in humility. Jesus continues to lead us through this, and he moves us from opinion to introspection. It's very easy to have an opinion on things, but in this conversation, Jesus is turning us to be introspective. Look what he says. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye? Pay no attention to the plank in your own eye. How can you say to your brother, let me take that speck out of your own eye, while all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. And this may be familiar. I think this has worked its way into kind of our just cultural speak oftentimes, right? Like we've heard this analogy. And Jesus paints this picture that's borderline comical, right? Like while he's teaching this, it would have been almost funny, right? Like just imagine someone with a giant plank in their own eye. And Jesus grew up as a carpenter, right? And he uses this to continue to flesh out this idea of judgment versus judgmentalism. And I can't help but read this exaggerated story that Jesus tells and not think of the importance of self-awareness. Because old Plank Eye in this story, he appears to be extremely, extremely unaware of himself. And I think that this is hard, to be self-aware, to pick out our own logs in our eyes. And I think it's sometimes, maybe it's even impossible, right? Because we all have blind spots. So it's easy for me to see the speck in that person's eye. Man, that drives me a little crazy. Man, I would handle that different. Man, they shouldn't do it that way. Oh, I can see. Because we can see their speck, but we aren't always self-aware to see the log that's in our own eye. It becomes a blind spot. In areas of our discipleship that we don't realize are underdeveloped, or maybe they're non-existent because we simply can't see it, right? We think that we're following Jesus. We can be prideful about certain things, but there are areas of our lives that we just can't see. The psalmist writes in Psalm 19, but who can discern their own errors? Forgive my hidden faults. That there sometimes are just things that we are unaware of. I have a family member who is horrible at whispering. Like we will be in a situation where it's quiet and they're like, man, that person, man, they're looking old, aren't they? I'm like, stop, right? Like, this can't whisper. My wife would say the same thing about me. I don't think this is true about me, but she would say this is true. That we'll be in a situation, I'm like, I really have to go to the bathroom. And she's like, everybody can hear you, right? And I'm like, that's not true. Nobody can hear me. I think I'm not self-aware, right? I think it's a blind spot to my inability to not whisper, right? And the catch-22 of this whole situation, when Jesus says, take the log out of your own eye so you can help with the speck in their eye, is that this all requires humble relationship. It requires humble relationship for me to remove the speck, but also for our own logs to be removed. I was just having a conversation with a friend this week, a young leader, and they were asking me some questions for a paper they were writing. And they said, what's some of the most important things about leadership? And I said, I think one of the most important things is to have people in your life that show you the areas that you can't see. Because if we want to be whole people, there are things that we are just unaware of. And the way that he put it, and I loved it, was, do we have mirrors in our lives? Have you ever had a mirror, if you're trying to check something on the back, you gotta look in a mirror to see if you can see something on your back, see if you got a mullet or what's going on, or if you got a spot didn't cut your hair or whatever. Right, there's blind spots that we just can't see normally. I remember when I was first learning to drive, I was going 76 west to 21 south, and I was going home. And I remember I got my driver's permit, I'm driving, and I checked that blind spot like no other, because I was merging. There was a big semi-truck behind me, and in my blind spot was another huge semi-truck. And I remember my mom just yelling at me, right, because I was about to get squished between these two semi-trucks. Why? Because it was in my blind spot. I couldn't see it, right? And we have to say, what are the mirrors in our lives that help us see our blind spots? Is it our spouse, our kids, our family, our close relationships, right? When you're in close relationships with other people, you start to see your blind spots, because it's gonna wear off on the people around us. I think this is why counselors can be so helpful. And this may be a professional counselor, but this also may be just relationships in your life, people who are of good counsel. Small group leaders, pastors, elders, teachers, whatever it may be in your life. It doesn't always have to be an appointment with the place, but wise counsel in your life. Maybe it's a family member that you can ask, hey, can you help me with this? What am I not seeing? And they're saying, yeah, your mirror only shows you this, but there's this whole other area behind you that you're not seeing. The way that you react to that situation, the way when you walk into a room, you kind of always suck the air out of it, the way that you don't take input very well, the way that you make light of every situation, the way that everything turns back upon you, the way that when you're uncomfortable, you respond this way, right? We all have blind spots that we're unaware of. And these mirrors help us to see those things. I think there's part of this when we're around people that are different than us, racially, socioeconomically, different gender, different generations, that we see blind spots. Generations have blind spots. Young people, not just the old ones, and old people, not just the young ones. We all have blind spots, and the pendulum can swing very hard. And there's this beautiful picture of the body of Christ that brings generations and races and genders together, that makes us better, that helps us see the full picture, because we all have blind spots. I think there's something helpful. Now, we can get obsessed with these things. I caution you against that. But sometimes, workplace assessments or personality tests, they, in a simple way, can help to be like, I do that. I do respond that way. That is something that I get energy from, or that is something I turn to when I'm struggling, right? And it can be just a simple mirror. Don't get too deep into these things, but whatever these mirrors are in our lives, right? Help us so that we may take that log out. Because as followers of Jesus, we can have a determination to tell others about Jesus. We can have disciplines in our lives that we want to be near Jesus and be aware of Jesus and be present to Jesus. But there, all this time, this extreme picture that Jesus paints a picture of is we can have a giant log in our eye. And I know for me, I don't want to be someone who thinks I'm following Jesus, but is missing a huge part of my discipleship to him. And this requires mirrors, requires inputs from others in our lives. But this doesn't end there. This doesn't end there, because look where Jesus goes. He continues, take the plank out of your eye, and then you can see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye, right? There's a full process here. He's not saying just be self-aware, but he's saying we need to be self-aware, have community, remove the logs, so that we can serve the brother, so that we can help. I think all of us, and maybe this is at different times, different relationships, can fall into different camps. For some of us, certain relationships, we're good at finding the planks in everybody's eye. Right? We'll tell you what's wrong, what you need to do better. We're real good at finding planks, right? If that's you, you know that's you. But others of us, we might be people who never want to touch a log. That we see a speck, we see a log in someone's eye, and we're like, I don't want to help with that. And it often sounds this way. We feel like Who am I? I know my own sin. I'm not perfect. Who am I to tell that person what's wrong with them? Some of you, that resonates with you. And so you'll be with a brother or sister who's just walking down a path of sin, who's making an unwise decision, who's hurting themselves, who's harming their marriage, who's maybe falling from Jesus. And you're like, but who am I? Right? And I think sometimes what that can be is it can actually be fear cloaked in humility. Who am I? I'm a sinner too. When really we're just scared to address something. I can relate to that. Or for some of us, it's just pride cloaked in passivity. You're like, I just don't really want to help. That situation feels messy, right? And I still want to get on that level. And there's something about what Jesus is saying here in this picture is, after humility, after introspection, after the log is removed, after this process of self-awareness, after humbling myself and being aware that I'm not judging because this measure is going to be used to me, that after that process that I come and I say, hey, I want to help you with something, that I serve this person by humbly removing this speck. Paul writes in the church in Galatia, brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in the sin, you who live by the Spirit, like you who are operating and walking with the Spirit, letting the Spirit produce fruit in your lives, should restore that person gently. It's not what you say, it's how you say it, right? You know that to be true. Restore the person gently. But it says this, but watch yourselves. Or you also may be tempted. What's he mean there? Watch yourselves. Watch yourselves, and you're not coming in a situation prideful. That you're not coming in a spirit of judgmentalism. That you're not coming in as the expert, right? But he says, but carry each other's burdens. In this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. If anyone thinks that there's something when they are not, they deceive themselves. You see this play out in the way Jesus' teaching plays out in Paul's instruction to this church. He's like, help one another, carry one another's burdens, but watch out. Do not do this in a spirit of pride, but in a spirit of humility. And what this creates is a mutual sanctification. And sanctification is a fancy church word, but all that means is the process of us becoming more like Jesus while we're here on earth. And when I come to you humbly to help address something in your life, that's sanctifying me, because that's not easy to do. And when the other party receives that, and you go through this process, carrying those burdens together, that we both become more like Jesus, right? But if we're just, no doubt about it, this is hard. This is messy, right? And you may do all this, and the person with the speck in their eye may respond poorly. And we're called to carry that burden. And for some of us, this speck removal may not just be one conversation. It may be an ongoing process. We carry that burden. That's what we're called to do as followers of Jesus, to carry one another's burdens. And it leads to this. I know you guys have been wanting to get into pig and dogs the whole time. That Jesus, as he moves us from pride to humility, from our opinion to introspection, moves us from disinterest. I don't know, it's their problem. They can figure it out. I don't care. To discernment, to pursuing wisdom, to pursuing the proper way to navigate some of these tensions. Look at what Jesus says. Do not give to dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under your feet and turn and tear you to pieces. This one's rough, right? Let's be honest, this was a little rough. And it reminds me of this. Jesus is not Mr. Rogers. Oftentimes, we can look at just the part of Jesus that's like, he's so loving and he's forgiving and he's humble. Yes. But sometimes we read certain things read through the Gospels, like Jesus in different situations to different people, he can have some sharp things to say. He was full of grace and truth. And that's just, we're going to navigate this, but I think that's just important for us to kind of a framework. We're always caught off guard, right? But Jesus is full of grace and truth. But I want to dig into what Jesus is saying here. And it's important for us to get into, like, Jesus has given us an analogy, and it takes some navigating. But I want to just ask a couple questions here first. The first question is so important. When he says here, don't throw your pearls to pigs, there's an old comic called Pearls Before Swine. Not relevant to what we're doing here at all. But the question is, what is the pearl? Like, as we look at this, first question is, okay, what is this pearl? And what's interesting is Jesus references a pearl one other time in the Gospel of Matthew, in Matthew 13, he says this, the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure. Jesus talked about this a couple, just a paragraph before this, before he talks about anxiety. It's like a treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again. And then in his joy, went and sold all he had and bought that field. Then Jesus continues kind of this picture in a different way. Again, the kingdom of heaven, not just then and there, but here and now, Jesus' rule, Jesus' reality, the way of life with Jesus, what he's teaching us about, is like a merchant looking for fine pearls. When he found one of great value, he went away and sold everything to buy that pearl. That pearl of great value that you're willing to sacrifice everything for. This pearl that Jesus is talking about is this pearl, the gospel of the kingdom, this beautiful, life-giving news that Jesus has come to rule as king. He's giving us a new way of life to live and know him, made possible through his life, his teachings, his death, his burial, and his resurrection. And the question as we navigate into this passage, you have to ask yourself, is look at the pearl. Do you believe that Jesus is the answer to every longing you have? That he's the pearl, that the kingdom is the pearl of great value? Like, do you believe that discipleship to Jesus, following, walking with, making Jesus Lord is the answer for every cultural, political, societal, and personal problem that we face as individuals and as a society? Do you believe that? Because it can be easy to be like, yes, Jesus is so good from going to heaven when I die, but we got to get this person in office because stuff's nuts. Yeah, I believe that Jesus, he loves everybody, but, you know, I kind of personally navigate things myself and kind of take what I need from Jesus, and then whatever feels right, I kind of go with that. Like, we have to truly believe that Jesus is the pearl of great price. Do you believe that the gospel is truly good news? Not just a good idea, not just a good philosophy, not just a good belief system, not just historically helpful, but is actually good news for you here and now and for the people in your life? Do you truly believe that? If Jesus is not your pearl, then this parable doesn't make a lot of sense. So if that pearl is the kingdom of Jesus and it's of utmost value, it begs the question, well, who are these pigs and dogs that Jesus is talking about? It feels cold. It feels un-Jesus-y, right? And there's no secret that pigs and dogs aren't like rabbits and bunnies, right? Like, pigs and dogs have negative connotations. They do now. Like, if someone calls you a pig or a dog, then they did then, right? Like, there's a negative connotation associated with this. And it's important, again, what he's not saying is that these pigs and dogs, those are big sinners with big sins just wallowing around in the mud of their sin. He's not categorizing some as horrible people that we shouldn't waste our time on. Those sinners who are really in the gutter, who are really big problems, don't waste your time on them. That's not what he's saying. Well, how do you know that, Aiden? Because when you know someone, you know their intention, you know their heart. And if you know Jesus, if you have saturated yourself, if you read the Gospels, if you spend any time with Jesus at all, you'd be like, well, Jesus is usually with prostitutes, with tax collectors who everybody hated, people who the Bible defines as sinners. That's who Jesus is usually with. He lets a prostitute woman of the night wash his feet. He stands up for a lady who's about to get stoned because of her sin. He goes to a party with Matthew and tax collectors, and he says, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, it's the sick. And so this frames this for us. So that's probably not who Jesus is talking about. He spent his whole life with these people. Jesus is using this language of pigs and dogs to represent those, like a pig or a dog would be, that are careless, that are hostile, or that are uninterested in the beauty of the pearl. If the pearl is of such great price, look at a dog or a pig. You're like, you think they care, right? I've been dealing with raccoons at my house, I'm not sure if I gave a raccoon a $20 bill if I'm like going to be frustrated that he doesn't make a wise investment with it, right? I'm like, yeah, I don't think he cares. And so when Jesus gives us this picture, I think it's representative of those that are they don't care about the pearl. They're maybe hostile to the pearl. They're uninterested in the pearl that you have, right? Which, as you read the story of the Gospels, it sounds a lot more like the Pharisees than it does the sinners and the tax collectors, right? And I think what Jesus is getting at here is the difference between trying to convince someone of something. Like, you have this great pearl and these people, these individuals who do not care. The difference between trying to convince them of something, which Jesus says that they may tear you to pieces, right? Where's my passage at? Is that clicker? Yeah, they may tear you to pieces. That they're trying to convince them versus compelling them with the beauty of the gospel, right? Compelling them with the beauty of forgiveness, the beauty of grace, the beauty of new life. And I think we see this today. There is so much rolling around in the mud, slinging harmful words, making accusations, being judgmental, using the Bible as a weapon to prove a point, or using Jesus' own words out of context to validate our predetermined view. And perhaps you found yourself in a situation where you've tried to communicate the beauty of Jesus' teachings in the midst of that mess, and you have found yourself beat up or misunderstood, or as Jesus says, torn to pieces because they do not care. The priority of someone's heart is politics, the Bible will be a partisan book. If the priority is self and what I want and my happiness and my identity and my expression, then the Bible will just be affirmation of that. If the priority is a winning, of coming out on top, the Bible will just be a proof text to validate whatever it is that I want to win. But if the priority is the kingdom, then the Bible becomes a story of the pearl. Because the Bible is a story of an all-powerful God who humbled himself as a frail and fragile human who came not to judge you, what John 3:17 tells us, but to save you. Who came to give this great pearl to us, to discover this pearl of great price. He came and he was rejected, torn apart by pigs and by dogs who wanted no part with him. But he rose again, inviting us into this pearl, into this life, right? And one day he will come again. And Scripture tells us to judge the living and to judge the dead, to rid the world of everything that destroys, everything that distorts, everything that disrupts the reality of his good kingdom. He's going to rid the world of it. And we will all stand before him. And for those that claim Christ, those who in their need, in their sin and in their brokenness, reach out for this pearl that has been offered to all of us, that we will be judged by his record, by what he has done for us, that he is the judge and he is also our defender, that when we stand before him, he will say, you are clear, you are perfect, you are clean, not because of what you've done, but because of what I've done. So we are sinners who are gracefully judged by what Christ has done for us. If this is the story, then perhaps as followers of Jesus, we should judge not. You can't convince someone that something is beautiful. A song that moves your soul deeply, you can't be like, come on, just let it move your soul deeply. When you see just a beautiful sunset, a beautiful scene that just touches the depths of your soul and you're with someone who just doesn't see it, you can't be like, come on, can't you see it? Right? Like, you can't convince someone that something is beautiful. The beauty of the object itself must compel them. And the beauty of the story of the gospel, this pearl of great price, is beautiful. And perhaps what Jesus is calling us to is not to try to convince someone lest they tear us back, but to just present the beauty of this story, the beauty of this kingdom, and let it speak for itself. I love just to end with just that. You just close your eyes this morning, wherever you're sitting. If you're driving, don't close your eyes, but maybe just being present to Jesus just for a moment. And I just want us to spend just a moment of being introspective. Just before the Lord. Maybe it's asking, Lord, do I truly believe that your gospel, your kingdom is beautiful? That it is of greatest worth, that it's my greatest desire? Just before the Lord, ask yourself, do you believe that that is true? maybe today as we navigate this, it's worth asking the Lord to maybe just show you where you might have a spirit of judgmentalism, where it's easy to cast your opinion, to cast your 2 cents on somebody else. Is there an area of your life where that just keeps showing up, just a spirit of judgmentalism? And I would encourage you to repent from that, to accept Jesus' forgiveness of that, and to ask the Spirit to lead you in a different direction. I think it's worth just asking the Lord that if there's a plank in your own eye, that His Spirit would help make you aware of it. Because Jesus, we want to be people who live in light of this beautiful pearl. The good news that you are the judge, but you are also our defender. That we have relationship with you because of what you've done in our place for us. And so, Jesus, I pray that you would humble us, that you would just help us to be aware of the ways that we let judgmentalism steer the ship, steer our relationships, that we let that take priority in our relationships and communication with people. I pray, Jesus, that you would give us wisdom, because you call us to have discernment, to navigate, to assess, to evaluate, to be wise. But at the same time, Jesus, it can be hard to navigate that in the midst of relationships. How long do we continue a conversation? How long do we continue to pursue a given situation? And so, Jesus, I pray that you would just give us wisdom in all these things, and that we might hold the gospel and the kingdom as a pearl of great price. And Jesus, I pray that we can't convince ourselves, but I pray that we would just gaze upon the beauty of the pearl, and that it would change us from the inside out. We love you, Jesus. Amen.